Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Best of Pedalshift. On this edition, we go all the way back to November 21st, 2019, for the episode I hope nobody ever needs to use, and that is emergency fixes. If you run into any serious mechanicals or sudden cold snaps on your next bike tour, listen up, because this episode has some things that might save your bacon. Hope you enjoy.
Next up on the show is The Lab, and The Lab is where we talk about experimental stuff. And on this episode, it is a very, very special episode of The Lab because we're talking about emergency fixes. We have talked about such things on past episodes of the pod. Go back to episode number 046 and 087. So it's been a minute since we've talked about this kind of stuff. For other tips, I'm not going to be repeating any of the tips that are in those episodes. So if this is the kind of thing that you're like, this is my jam, go back and listen to those episodes if you haven't already. So I've got, let's see, including, well, that was number one. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, I've got 6 things that I'm going to talk about on this episode. And that was one of them. So I've got 5 more. This feels like a lazy list if you ask me. Number 1 is go check out Pedalshift 046 and 087 for other tips. I don't know why I'm laughing at myself for this, but let's go to all the way to number 2 now. The second thing that I want to talk about here for emergency fixes. Dealing with a busted rack. I have got a picture in the show notes. This I found ages and ages ago, and I think that this is amazing. Picture yourself riding along, and all of a sudden, this has happened to me, by the way, your rear rack all of a sudden just pivots and falls backwards. It's still sort of attached a little bit, at least on one side, but the upright stanchion has sheared off due to rattling and weights and maybe a flaw in the design or whatever. And all of a sudden it's busted. It's not just, your bolt has come off, but it's actually straight up busted. And what are you going to do? You've got panniers. Maybe you're in the middle of nowhere. I was really lucky. It happened to be that it was a sheared off bolt, but I have seen situations where it's actually the rack itself that is busted, and the picture in the show notes is a great example of it. How do you fix such things? Do I have to go get a welder or whatever? Well, you're probably not going to have access to that. If you do, hey, man, fantastic, go for it. But we're talking emergency fixes here. The best way to deal with something like that is to do what we do with broken bones in emergency situations. That is to create a splint. The best way to do that is with something that is metal. Yes, you could conceivably use a stick or something like that, but that's not going to be able to handle the kind of weight that we're putting on it. Now, if your panniers are anything like mine, you may be holding 30, 40 pounds, maybe more on that rear rack, and a piece of wood just isn't going to cut it for the splinting. And duct tape just isn't going to cut it either, although I'm a huge fan of duct tape. I think I may even have some duct tape. I certainly do in those past episodes. What I would recommend and what this picture shows is to use something that's metal, and you may end up using, in this case, it looks like it was a bike tool. It was some type of a wrench that was used. It was metal, and then zip ties. And I mean a lot of zip ties. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them in this instance to really cinch that on tight and use that splint to get you through, to get you back up and running, to get you to the point so that you can at least hold something on the rack. Now, maybe you're going to want to remove some of the weight off of that rack as well, but at least you've got a functioning rack at that point, and it can get you to the next town, or maybe even a little bit further, but at least to the next town where you can get a more permanent fix, or you can get a new rack. But I really think that that's something that is an important lesson, an important emergency fix for you to be able to do, because it can save your trip. It can stop you from having to, abandon your gear, which would be a terrible thing in the middle of nowhere. Because frankly, some stuff in your bags you need. I mean, you need your tent. You need your stuff to stay warm if it's cold out. So a splint, a metal splint plus zip ties. Hose clamps is another way to do this. But I do know that zip ties are light. They're cheap. They're easy to work with, and if you use 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, they can really be a weight-bearing type of a thing for a temporary fix. And on an emergency situation, this is the way to go. So go check that out. Busted rack, consider using a metal splint and some zip ties to make it all happen. And hose clamps also will work as well. All right, number 2 for emergency fixes on this episode. If you're experiencing a sudden temperature drop, and here we are in the middle of fall, mid-fall, late fall, depending on where you're at. If you're down in the southern hemisphere, I apologize. Happy summer. A sudden temperature drop. We just had one recently here in DC. We went from, that cool, crisp sweater weather to straight up below freezing temperatures literally overnight. It was crazy how fast it got cold. I went out for lunch the other day and I was shocked at how unprepared I was for the sudden temperature drop. Now, it wasn't enough for something like what I'm about to recommend here, but this is something that I think works really well. Hat tip to the Community Cycling Center in Portland, Oregon, where I got the Green Goblin from for this idea. If there's a sudden temperature drop, layer up with newspapers or anything else you have on hand in between your layers. So let's say you were like me the other day. I had a puffy vest and I had basically a button-down shirt, and that was about it. So it wasn't so bad that I needed this, but what I would do is I would have tucked in the vest. I know, solid look, dude. But we're talking emergency fixes here if you're super cold. Maybe grabbed one of those free newspapers from the bins that are out there in DC and just put one in between the puffy vest and my shirt. And actually what that's going to do is it's going to create more air pockets to warm up, and it's going to do what your mom always told you to do, wear layers. I was unprepared then, but I could have done that and that would have heated me up. Now, if you're out on the trail or you're out on the road or something like that and you don't have a newspaper bin handy, probably not, maybe, who knows, grab something out of one of your panniers or your frame bag or whatever and layer up in between there. It's a quick hack. It's not going to be great for absolutely everything, but it is going to keep your core temperature a little bit warmer and can get you to where you can get to some actual warmth or maybe to camp or whatever like that. So sudden temperature drop, layer up, maybe even with newspaper, magazine, something like that. That actually works really, really well. So hats to the Community Cycling Center for that idea. Number 4. This one I have never used. This is one that I've never carried, but I am really, really intrigued by it. I think that this is a listener recommendation from back in the day. I do have, and I apologize because I did not write down who it was. If this was your idea, thank you for that. I'm giving you credit, just not by name. Scotch Cast or Fiber Fix. It's sold commercially as 3M casting tape, but there are other brands other than 3M out there. You can get it at a hardware store. You can get it at vet hospitals. You can get it at emergency health centers. These are basically what doctors use to make casts. The listener that wrote in carries a full roll and a bag cut into some pieces to use on all sorts of things. It's sort of like super duper duct tape in a sense. You get it wet and then it cures. The listener used it to fix rim cracks on wheels, if you can believe it. 10 poles and tons of other types of items out there. It's super light. This stuff, it's like, I don't know how to describe it. It's like gauze almost. It's like stiff gauze. You get it wet in warm water and then it dries in a few minutes and it is rock hard. You want to layer it. You want to wrap it around, but it is really, really good. It can be bought for $5 to $10. Creates a waterproof seal, and it is strong as steel in some instances, depending on how you kind of wrap it around and fix it. It's amazing. I think the fact that it's able to handle something like a rim crack or tent poles or stuff where it's kind of you need something heavy duty. I think it's an amazing thing, and it's something that I certainly am going to consider carrying going forward, especially for longer tours that are in more rural areas. You're always going to have a little bit of warm water on hand. Look, if you don't have water on hand, you've got a bigger emergency. But this is the type of thing that might be helpful for getting through a real heavy duty emergency. So Scotch Cast, Fiber Fix, 3M casting tape, whatever you want to call it, from whomever you buy it. I think that that's a really good idea. I've got a link in the show notes on Amazon to one particular brand. Your mileage may vary. I don't think there's any one brand that's better than another, but take a look at that as a potential thing to have in your emergency repair kit. Just a little bit can go a long way, and it can get you potentially from a catastrophic situation to something to get you into a town, to a bike shop, to get something to be repaired. All right, number 5. This is a good one. This one I've kind of inadvertently done myself, but I think that, again, community cycling center, getting this idea. Have you lost a bolt ever on any of your rides? Your rack is where it happens the most, and that can be just such a bummer. I've had this happen a lot. This is why I always recommend that you use a little bit of Loctite on your rack bolts and anything else that can kind of rattle out. You'd be surprised. One little drop. I use the blue. They're all different colors. I think some grip harder than others, but the blue is, I think it's the exact right stickiness that you need, and it'll hold a rack bolt in place for a long time until it doesn't, because I've had them rattle out even with Loctite on there. If you lose a bolt or a rack bolt shears off, which I have also had happen to me, look at the rest of your bike, because you might be able to cannibalize something from another place that isn't as important, say a water bottle holder. Unscrew the bolt from that. A lot of times it's going to be the exact same size bolt that can fit and reaffix your rack. I've actually done this before, and then I've forgotten about it, and then I read this tip here from Community Cycling Center. Such a great idea. The person who wrote this, I think I've got the link in the show notes. Well, I'm just checking here. Do I have the actual link? I have the actual link. Yes. The person here recommended riding with the size of bolt that actually would be more helpful for the rack rather than for the smaller version that you would need in terms of length for the water bottle holder, just so you've got that extra properly sized rack bolt as a spare, just riding along with you. I think it's an amazingly great idea to do that. Look for what else you can cannibalize on your bike. Maybe it's not going to fit the same way, but at least it might be something that you can use to get yourself going. Again, if you don't have a rack that's affixed right, and this goes back to, the prior example up in number 2 about metal splinting, if you can't have your rack sit right, you're not going anyplace with that rack, So any way that you can kind of hack together a way to get your rack reaffixed and going, that can at least get you to the next town, to get you a proper fix, do it. This is a great example of something like that. Using a bolt from another part on your bike that you don't necessarily need as much for something that you need a lot more. Great tip. Last but not least, I promise this, number 6, duct tape. It gets its own category. You know who else is going to live with duct tape? Its friend, zip ties. I'm here to tell you, the example from earlier with the metal splint on getting the rack back up again, super, super helpful. But between duct tape and zip ties, you would be shocked at how much you can get away with those two things as emergency fixes. It's not going to be something that I would recommend riding on full time. It's not going to be something that I would recommend being the final fix. Oh, I'll just tour on this the rest of the way. But it can get you through in a pinch. And I'm going to retell the story that I've told in a variety of different ways on the podcast. I had a pretty catastrophic tire problem in, it might have been more than 5 years ago. It was one of the first times I tried cycling the Gap, and I had a horrific sidewall tear in a way that I wasn't able to keep a tube inflated. I went through all of my tubes. So I had basically a sidewall blowout with a tear that essentially made it so that all of my tubes were wrecked in a way that were unrepairable. And it was getting cold and it was getting dark. And I needed to keep going. And so what did I do? I basically zip tied my wheel to my tire to my wheel, so that it held, so that it wouldn't flop out as I rolled. And I was able to get up to the point where I was at the top of a hill. And this, for those of you who have ridden the Gap, is a really, really, really long downhill. And I thought it was going to take me a couple of hours to get to the next town, Frostburg, for those familiar. And I thought, wait a second, let me disengage the brake. Let me zip tie this wheel that's probably going to get thrown away anyways. For those of you who are like, whoa, dude, what are you about to do? You're about to ride on that busted wheel? Well, I zip tied the tire to the wheel, and it just sort of kept making this thunking sound every time the zip ties went through. They sort of nicked on the side of the disengaged brakes, but it was enough clearance so that it could go. And I was able to roll down that hill. I want to say it was several miles worth. I think it might have been up to 3 or 4 miles of downhill riding. But rather than pushing the bike along at a much slower pace, I was able to ride, and I got there in a matter of minutes as opposed to hours and hours and hours of riding, of pushing. And that was all thanks to a little bit of zip ties and indeed some duct tape as well to kind of keep everything held together while I went down there. And yeah, the tire was toast, and it certainly didn't do it any favors, riding on the rims down there. But, I kept my weight on the back as much as possible because it was the front tire. So, strangely enough, the front tire, because it's never the front tire, it's always, say it with me now, the back wheel, because of course. It was actually the front on this time, and that was the one that allowed me to be able to do it. But zip ties and duct tape got me through that and saved me from having a real cold night and a real tough time. Ended up in a hotel that night, and you know what? There ended up not being a bike shop that could help me out up there, but it ended up working out just fine because of the magic of duct tape and zip ties. So that is my good story for you. So you should always carry zip ties and duct tape with you. If I will leave a multi-tool at home before I leave duct tape and zip ties at home, especially after that experience. So let's go back through it one more time. My top tips here in 2019 for emergency fixes. Number 1, go listen to my podcast again. Episodes number 46 and 87. For other tips as well. Number 2, dealing with a busted rack, consider a metal splint and zip ties. Number 3, temperature drop, consider layering up with newspaper or other things that you might have on you underneath your outer layer so that you can have more layers. Really, really helpful. Thank you, Community Cycling Center, for that. Number 4, Scotch Cast Fiber Fix or 3M casting tape. Really amazing what that can do. Number 5, cannibalizing a bolt from another part of your bike that you need it less for something that you need it more if it is broken or sheared off or has been lost. And number 6, of course, my friend and yours, duct tape and its companion zip ties. A huge, huge, huge way to do an emergency fix to get you back on the trails or on the road. Hopefully that is all helpful for you. And as with all tellings, all tips that I have on emergency fixes, I hope you never, ever have to use them.
Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.